Namaste. Today I am going to be talking to you about a very special dimension of SriAurobindo, which is SriAurobindo, a Rishi and a multilingual genius. I will first talk about him as a multilingual genius, and all of us who know his life story are aware of the fact that he was a master of various languages, and I'll just tell some of them to you. So he was familiar with almost 12 to 13 languages that he mastered to a sufficient degree to have access to their literature also. So he was an absolute genius with English, French and Bengali. He could speak, read and write these languages. He also was very familiar with Latin, Greek and Sanskrit, and he knew how to read and write them. He was also familiar with Gujarati, Marathi and Hindi, which he could speak and read, and besides that he was knowledgeable about Italian, German and Spanish. These languages he could only read them, and later on when he came to Pondicherry he started his studies in Tamil. So I'll just go through that. So he had English, French, Bengali, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, Italian, German, Spanish and Tamil. So we see that as a linguist, his proficiency with the languages gave him access to a lot of the literature and also the ability to connect with the mind of the people. One of the things that is very special about language is that language in general is the manner in which we articulate our experiences of life itself. So every individual has a certain impact of the world on their mind, which finds its expression through the language that they're most familiar in usually. Now, talking about SriAurobindo as a multilingual genius, his study started when he was in India itself. From here he became familiar more with English initially, and when he went to England, it gave him a wide introduction to the culture of ancient and medieval and of modern Europe. He was a brilliant scholar in Greek and Latin. He also learned French from his childhood in Manchester and studied for himself German and Latin sufficiently to read Goethe and Dante in the original tongues. He passed his tripos in Cambridge in the first division and obtained record marks in Greek and Latin in examination for the Indian Civil Service. All these are when SriAurobindo writes about himself in his life sketch. And at Baroda, when he came back to India, he made it a point to pick up many other Indian languages. So he started with Sanskrit and he used to devour books and familiarize himself with the script of the language, the grammar of the language, etc. He learned Sanskrit and several modern Indian languages. He did not learn Sanskrit through Bengali, but he learned Sanskrit itself or through English. Now, regarding SriAurobindo's knowledge of Tamil, so there are some who believe that SriAurobindo could possibly read and write, but at Pondicherry he took up the study of Tamil, but he did not go very far because he then interrupted his study when he went into complete retirement. So we see that he had this great facility of accessing different languages, and therefore when we talk of him as a linguist, he also becomes eligible to look at language, at the science of language itself, because his familiarity with so many languages allowed him to do a very authentic comparison on the basis of these different languages. And we also see that SriAurobindo, when he studied language, he was not just looking at it as a means of communication, because when we think of language, our usual understanding of the term is limited to its role in facilitating communication, and more or less we tend to stick to that part of language itself, where language is meant for just communicating one's idea to another. So that is a very utilitarian purpose. But SriAurobindo, being a Rishi, delved much deeper and tapped into another dimension of the entire expression of language itself. I'll just give you a little insight about who a Rishi is in SriAurobindo's own words. So he says that a Rishi was not the individual composer of the hymn, but the seer, a drashta, because the word Rishi literally means the drashta, a seer. He says, of an eternal truth and an impersonal knowledge. The language of Veda itself is Shruti, a rhythm not composed by the intellect but heard, a divine word that came vibrating out of the infinite to the inner audience of the man who had made himself, who had previously made himself fit for the impersonal knowledge. The words themselves, drishti and shruti, sight and hearing, are Vedic expressions. These and cognate words signify, in the esoteric terminology of the hymns, revelatory knowledge and the contents of inspiration. So the origins of language as we have them documented are first there in the Vedic texts, and the nature of the Vedic texts is that they were revelations that were received by rishis in the heights of their meditation. So I try to understand this from a different perspective and try and make sense of what SriAurobindo is really trying to say when he talks about the rishis in that sense, and the role of language really, but viewed from this deeper emergence of understanding reality and its impact on the mind of the individual who is trying to express it. So if we look at the Rishi's journey, the Rishi was trying to make sense of the world. There are two ways of making sense of the world. One is that we just look at whatever is around us and we talk about it either based on our previous conditionings, where we know that this particular object is associated with this word, and then we apply that in our use of language. Another way of doing it, and this is what the Vedic rishis did, is they recognized very early on that when we are expressing our understanding of the world, most often our understanding of the world is mediated through lenses. So we don't really look at reality for what it is in its essential vibratory nature. And this is something that is very interesting, that everything in the universe, if we regard it as being fundamentally made of energy stuff, is composed of some form of vibration or the other. So there is vibration underlying everything. So any object that we might pick up, let's say this book also has its own vibratory nature. A glass, the glass also has its own vibratory nature. A pen has its own specific vibratory nature. But because we are not tuned to receive the vibratory impact of the glass in its authenticity, or rather in its natural spirit, we attribute a certain term to denote the glass. Alright, so the rishis, they recognized early on that our interpretation of the world is being mediated through the lenses we wear. And this takes us back to a very interesting theory of language itself in the Indic context, which talks of the 4 levels of speech. So we've got para, which is the beyond, and then we have pashyanti, or the seeing, when the individual makes contact with that reality that is there. And then we have madhyama, where that contact with reality starts getting translated through the being of the individual. And that being, mind you, is not like a plain, noiseless structure. That inner space through which that vibratory impact is getting translated is a very noisy structure. So when an individual encounters a reality, it can be an idea, it can be an object, there is invariably a translation that is taking place through the medium, and I would say the vibratory medium of the individual, which then finds its expression through the vocal cord and is expressed as vaikhari, or the sound that is heard and that is communicated. So these are the 4 stages. So there is para, the beyond, and when we are talking of beyond, it implies that irrespective of our existence on earth, creation continues, and everything continues in a kind of almost like an ideal interconnection of existence. I think the human beings are the only ones who have entered into this picture and created a lot of havoc. But if the human species was not there, then nature would be functioning in a kind of an incredible orchestra, a symphony of great harmonies. So the human being, and therefore we see that, these birds, they have their own language where they are able to communicate without having the interference of mind on the content that they are trying to communicate to their own species. So I will also be talking about it a little later in greater detail, but it's interesting to recognize the fact that if you look at the world in terms of vibrations, then every vibration corresponds to a very specific effect, and that effect also depends on the medium on which it is interfacing. So let's say if there is a particular music that hits the body, let's say if it's heavy metal or something like that, then the body will move in a particular manner. But if you listen to classical music, then the body will move differently. So there is vibration which is having an impact on the physical structure and creating a particular outcome and influencing it to behave in a particular manner. Similarly, these vibrations impact the emotional being, the pranic being, and have their own bhava, or they create their own responses. When it impacts the mind, it generates its own kind of thoughts. So like it happens to some of us, if you're traveling in a foreign land and you hear your own language, the impressions that it creates or it evokes is very unique to the sounds of that particular language. So we see that vibrations impact surfaces, and the different medium or the different media they are impacting manifests itself in a particular expression. But so then we see that when we are talking of the vibration itself and the birds, so every creature utilize, or rather the vocal system of every creature modifies that experience that needs to be communicated to its own species in a very specific manner. So languages exist, but those languages that exist in nature other than the human being are not mediated through the mind, and that's a very big difference that is noticeable between the languages of the human being and the languages of the animal species, or the languages of nature as per se. Now coming back to our story of the Rishi and how the Rishis received the Vedic knowledge. So the Vedic Rishi, as I said, recognized very early that what they are seeing is not necessarily reality as such. The Vedic Rishis realized very early that what they are seeing is not necessarily a transmission or an expression of reality as such. What they are seeing is getting mediated through their various lenses that they have, and therefore in order to express a direct experience of the world around them, they recognize the need to quieten or to eliminate the noise of the mental being. And therefore, as they eliminated the noise of the mind, the emotions, the physical being, they were receptive to listening to the answers of the universe to certain fundamental questions they had. And these fundamental questions were: who am I? What is the purpose of life? Where are we headed? And what is the relationship that I have with the world? So when the Rishi became this very peaceful receiver of the answers of the universe, he was impacted in a particular manner. He or she, because we have a lot of Rishikas as well, they were impacted in a particular manner, and so the para exists, so it's all out there, knowledge is out there. The Rishi, in the silence of their being, allowed themselves to be impacted, which was the Pashyanti. That then got translated through a medium which was very quiet and silent, and therefore there were no distortions, and that then expressed itself through the human vocal system. And in the case of the Rishis, it came out in the Sanskrit language, and we see that SriAurobindo, because of this nature of the reception, attributes to Sanskrit a role of Deva Bhasha, or the source language, which has retained the original formations of the vibrations in their expression, or in their native expression of the experience that they carry. Alright, so these vibrations were unadulterated by the human system as they manifested themselves in the form of the Sanskrit language. And it's also possibly the reason why we see that in the Sanskrit language there is such a perfection of the sound system, because the language that came through manifested or found its expression in the human throat and became articulated in a perfection of sounds. And the very first utterances of the Vedic Rishis that are recognized as the Vedas came in the form of mantras. And the nature of a mantra is that it is systematized sound technology, where sounds are carriers of the original vibratory nature of the frequency or the vibration that they carried. So the mantra therefore had that power. Now we see that in the case of language itself, I think that the diversity, and what SriAurobindo also talks about, in fact, he says that the diversity of languages happens because the mind that is responding to reality has its own shades of colors, and because it has its own shade of colors, the perception of reality gets refracted through those shades and ends up in a certain selection of basic sounds that form the foundations of that particular language structure. Secondly, the mind of that individual also, because of its conditionings, tends to look at the world through a particular structural lens, which also formats or offers the formatting or the grammatical structure of that particular language. So the reason why we have this very rich diversity of languages is because of the diversity of mental structures through which reality is getting translated and getting articulated through the multiple languages. SriAurobindo talks of this, and he takes this much deeper. So when he tried to go to the origins of language, because it was also a time when there were many scholars who were philologists who were trying to create a certain theory of language and language origins. And unfortunately, what SriAurobindo also talks about is how they tended to mix it up with ethnicity and race, and because there was a whole colonial plan that they needed to justify, and in order to justify that, they used these relationship of language families in order to prove a point. But SriAurobindo dispels all those approaches, and he says that he doesn't deny the similarities in the language groups, but he says that that is not really the way to go. So he says that we must go deeper. I'll just take it from before that. So he says, even the classification of tongues as Aryan and Dravidian, Semitic, cannot be called scientific. It is empirical and depends on identities which may not be fundamental. We must go deeper. European philology has started from word identities and identities of final word meaning. I propose to start from root identities and identities of original and derivative root meanings, and even from sound identities and identities of fundamental and applicatory sound meaning. He says it is, I believe, possible in this way to establish the unity of the Aryan tongues and some at least of the laws governing the birth and development of Aryan speech. My inquiry does not carry me further, and he says, I do not pretend as yet to inquire into the laws of speech itself, but only to establish from data some facts of Aryan speech which may eventually help in solving the wider problem. I'd also like to share with you another part which I touched upon right now, where he says that the language of man is not framed on earth, but in heaven, as indeed are all things. And this is perhaps the para part that he is referring to. He says that the language of man is not framed on earth, but in heaven, as indeed are all things that the soul uses in its mortal journey. By the threefold energy of eternal truth, manifesting force and sustaining delight, everything is created as a type in the world of ideas, the Mahat of the ancients, in the principles of self-manifest and perfectly arranged knowledge. It is diversely developed by the more discursive but less sure-footed agencies of intellectual mind. So this intellectual mind intervening in the expression of language or the manifestation of the heard, the audible sound, is something that also is responsible for the diversification or the diversity of languages. He says, imagination hunts after new variations, memory and association corrupt, analogy perverts, sensation, emotion, pleasure sees violent and partial satisfaction. Hence, change, decay, death, rebirth, the law of the world. All this takes place in the descent into the worlds of mind and the worlds of matter. Therefore, mankind has one original language based on certain eternal types of sound, developed by certain laws of certain types of sound, developed by certain laws of rhythmic variation, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in its structure and evolution. This is the Deva Bhasha and is spoken in the Satya Yuga. Then it suffers change, detrition, collapse. Innumerable languages, dialects, vernaculars are born. The guardians of the sacred language attempt always to bring back the early purity, but even they cannot do it. They reconstruct it from time to time. Compromise with the new tendencies, preserve something of the skeleton, lose the flesh, blood, sinew, much of the force and spirit. This reconstructed language they call Sanskrit, all else is Prakrit. So very interesting to see, especially in the context of the Indian languages. He talks about it in greater detail in the Aryan origins of Aryan speech, but he tries to show that every sound, as we spoke of earlier, has a specific vibratory nature. You see, if we look at the world again in terms of the vibrations, the very fact that it is in manifestation, first and foremost, implies a partial expression of a larger potential reality. When that sound with a particular frequency is uttered, it is meant to generate a particular focus of consciousness in manifestation. And we see that with light, we see that with forms, and therefore in the Sanskritic tradition you also talk of the mantra, the yantra and the tantra, which connects these three aspects, where there is the sound, there is a form and there is a philosophy. So all of this is embedded structures at different levels of manifestation. In the case of the Sanskrit language, because of the origins that we have seen, and SriAurobindo takes it further to call it the Deva Bhasha, he says already the Sanskrit language has attempted to retain some of that purity, but in its expression it is not as holistic as possibly the Deva Bhasha itself. And we can understand that also from the perspective that Sanskrit itself has the Vedic Sanskrit and the classical Sanskrit. The classical Sanskrit emerged from the 600 BC or so, when Panini categorized it and classified it properly in his, and gave it its present structure through his Ashtadhyayi. So the flexibility that is there in the Vedic Sanskrit loses its freedom of multiple expressions when it gets restricted through structure, through a specific structure of the Sanskrit language. Alright, so coming back to the source of language and coming back to how the mind fragments reality in its expression, SriAurobindo attempts to take us back to that source sound, because we see that while there is a diversity of language and all these languages are very unique in the worldview that they represent, if one gets limited in one's consciousness to only the expression, not even the spirit of the language, just to the expression of that language, then one would necessarily have a kind of a sense of a differentiation with everybody else. So what SriAurobindo proposes in his ideal of human unity also, he suggests that if one wants to transcend the diversity of expressions, then one has to look beyond its limited articulation in specific languages and try and tap into the deeper vibratory nature which exists in all languages but finds limited expressions in the nature of the languages that follow. So I can show you a little bit of this with the Sanskrit language itself. So with the Sanskrit language, we see that first there is the Vedic Sanskrit, which has this flexibility, and Shirobindo talks of it when he talks of the fact, I will try and show you this, this aspect here, where he says that in his language theory, he says that we can, first and foremost, he says that when these philologists are trying to talk about language, they recognize that there are groups of words. So there are these different kinds of words. So he says there is doceo, doctrina, doctor, docilis, document, doctus, docte, and just by the sound of it we know that they all would necessarily belong to a family. But then he says that they have another set of words. So he says where you have doleo, which means I grieve, dolentere means painfully, dolor, grief. So these seem to have a similar sense and obvious connected. Then he says there is dolus, which is fraud, dolusus, deceitful, dolose, deceitful. These are also interconnected, as we can see. Then he says dolo, I hew or cut or break, dolabra and axe, and these are also interconnected. But then he says that philologists did not see the underlying connection between these three groups of families of words. Alright, but he says that if we go to the Sanskrit language, he says we are able to trace the roots of these connections. So he puts forth in fact three hypotheses. So he says that I shall start from, he says the hypothesis I shall start from is that there can be no such want of connection, that dole to grieve, dole to split and dole to deceive must have been and are one root and not three, and the three different significances that are now attached to them have been developed not by caprice, chance or arbitrary selection, but have a natural connection and were developed in intellect and were developed in intellect by an intelligible psychological movement behind intellect from an original common meaning or mind impression created in the Aryan mind by the sound dol. Okay, so he's positing in this hypothesis that underlying the apparently three different groups of words that have dol, he says that if you can trace, it is possible to trace the source of it, which would have a similar nature, and if you can psychologically identify the source, then we see how these three apparently diverse groups of families of words will have a common source. And in that he has a second theory where he says that these, it's not just the three dull families or to be one family, but he says that there must have been one root sound and that have originally one root meaning, and that all kindred root sounds must also be of one family and have proceeded from a simple sound consisting of consonant and vowel, which is common to all of them, and the guna or natural mind impressions belonging to that simple sound must have been the basis not only of the intellectual significances common to its progeny, but to those even which vary most from each other. So da is a simple root sound. So coming back to what I had been spoken of earlier on, that if these vibrations exist, they impact when they impact a surface, they create an experience, and in this case they are impacting the mind surface and creating, so the sound the will have a root experience that it generates. But then you have the secondary roots, which are dal, dumb, dub, dash. So we see that that root consonant with a vowel and then added with different consonants will again keep shaping the atmosphere around it from a sound structure perspective. So I'd invite you to actually try and visualize the universe in the form of vibrations, and then you will start making sense of what SriAurobindo is trying to talk of as a Rishi who's looking at the universe in its underlying energy formation. Okay, so we have, for example, when he's saying that you make the sound the, because the third hypothesis is that there are these groups of words also. So you have the, it starts with the, the, n. So because they're all pronounced from the same place, he says that you will find similarities across these groups. But so so there is this kind of a group similarity that is there depending on the place of pronunciation of the letters. Secondly, there is just with the itself. So the and all the words that emerge from there will have their own experiential quality, and when you add them with the extra consonants, that then modifies the sound again in a slightly different manner. And he says that for the Vedic Rishi, who was not necessarily looking at the world through the modern structures of, cutting up reality and thereby limiting the meaning of words. So he says, if you talk of the word vrika, and I'll try and share this with you. He talks of the word vrika, where he says that it is the wolf. And he says that the wolf, for example, he says that the modern mind, when it thinks of a wolf, it thinks of that animal which is, four-legged and which is a carnivorous animal. It's a canine species who hunts in packs. So the modern mind tends to only look at the superficial attributes of the object that it is trying to denote. And this almost superficial representation of reality is very different from the Vedic mind that was impacted by the essential swabhava or the essential nature of that creature itself. So he says that the Vedic Rishi, when they saw a wolf, they would have said, they do not just say that here is a wolf, but simply that they see that this is a terror, and they use the word vrika. So vrika here, which means that it has the idea of tearing. And now that idea of tearing by repeated use with certain objects then acquires a specific meaning to mean a wolf. But the word vrika doesn't become limited by the wolfness of the wolf because it retains its original sense of the tearing component of it. And that tearing is again derived further to the root vr, the vr, and it's something that just by the expression of it we can feel the power of that tear that SriAurobindo is referring to, and that the Vedic Rishis experienced when they talked of the vrika, again not just in the physical sense of the wolf in the context of the literal meaning of the Vedas, but then if you go to the psychological meaning and you take it further, you see that if there's any movement in the consciousness that tears us apart, it can also be referred to as a vrika. So you can see vrika as a terror of the inner being, of forces that are tearing us apart. You can look at vrika as the tearing up of let's say another animal that has been killed by the wolf. But the word vrika does not get hijacked in the Vedic language or that source language by the objects that are used to depict that word, or the word that is used to depict that particular object. So we see that SriAurobindo, when he's talking of his theory of Aryan speech, he has these three steps, and I'll take you back through it. So the first he says is that there are different families of words which have a common source, and then that the secondary roots also belong to that family of words. And finally he says the third step in the hypothesis is to accept the supposition and to lay the rule that all simple roots form a sound by the accretion of a vowel to the consonant. So like he says, if you have words with di or du or dr, they will all have a similar kind of a meaning. And this is what SriAurobindo is trying to develop when he is talking of the origins of Aryan speech. So just when we are talking of SriAurobindo as a Rishi and a linguist, we see that his knowledge of these multiple languages allowed him the possibility of connecting not just to the applied sense of the words of the different languages that he had mastered, but because he was also a Rishi, it gave him that extra insight into the source of words. And because as a Rishi, the vision of the Vedic Rishi was not bound to the perception of differences of the world, which is in stark contrast to the ordinary human being. The ordinary human consciousness almost thrives on differences in order to establish unique identities. But the consciousness of the Rishi is appreciative of these diversities but is not carried away by them in their absoluteness. The mind of a Rishi, or the vision of the Rishi, the seeing of the Rishi transcends the manifested diversities and seeks to connect to the unifying consciousness that underlies it all. And the beauty of this approach of SriAurobindo's in trying to make these linguistic connections of different language families almost is that he is enabling us as readers to also appreciate the commonalities that exist across different word groups. But beyond the commonalities, beyond the commonalities of just the families, there is a call that I found in SriAurobindo's works to always refer back to the source and to recognize that once you can tap into that source, then even if the expressions are multiple, even if the language in which the expression is happening, one can still retain that original spirit. And that's why with SriAurobindo we see that he was able to write about his very high spiritual experiences in the English language. The English language itself is of a very artificial nature. What I mean by artificial is it's a very mentally structured language, and but he is able to use this language in order to express a deeper dimension of consciousness, because the source from which he is writing is a source that is not limited by the consciousness of the language itself. And I think I'd like to sort of wind it up here and just share with you about when he's talking of the diversity of languages. He says that the diversity of languages serves two important ends of the human spirit: a use of unification and a use of variation. A language helps to bring those who speak it into a certain large unity of growing thought, formed temperament, ripening spirit. It is an intellectual, aesthetic and expressive bond which tempers division where division exists and strengthens unity where unity has been achieved. Especially it gives self-consciousness to national or racial unity and creates the bond of a common self-expression and a common record of achievement. On the other hand, it is a means of national differentiation and perhaps the most powerful of all, not a barren principle of division merely, but a fruitful and helpful differentiation. For each language is the sign and power of the soul of the people which naturally speaks it. Each develops therefore its own peculiar spirit, thought, temperament, way of dealing with life and knowledge and experience. If it receives and welcomes the thought, the life experience, the spiritual impact of other nations, still it transforms them into something new of its own, and by that power of transmutation, it enriches the life of humanity with its fruitful borrowings and does not merely repeat what has been gained elsewhere. Therefore, it is of the utmost value to a nation if the human group soul, therefore, it is of the utmost value to a nation, a human group soul, to preserve its language and to make of it a strong and living cultural instrument. So, this is the value that SriAurobindo is giving to the need to preserve the richness of the diversity of different languages that are related to different cultures. But then he also adds at the end, in SriAurobindo's worldview, peace will not come from a uniform language which is logically simple and scientifically rigid. Rather, peace will arise from a living oneness full of healthy freedom and variation. This is the ideal which we should keep in view and strive to get realized in man's future. And therefore his vision then for a sense of a spiritual oneness in the midst of an enriching diversity of languages is that each language being the sign of the cultural life of a people, the index of its soul in thought and mind that stands behind and enriches its soul in action. So I think when we are talking of Sri Aurobindo as a Rishi and a multilingual genius, we can conclude that his deep understanding of the origins of language, the structures of language, the relationship of the language with the culture and the soul of the people, in accompaniment with the fact that he was essentially a Rishi himself, allows him to present this diversity in the fullness of its richness of expression, of manifestation. Because if you look at nature itself, when nature is manifesting herself, she thrives in this abundance of expression. And the diversity of languages is really an expression of that abundance of self-expression. But we would get misled if we failed to recognize the fact that behind it all, there is a unitary consciousness. And each language therefore can serve as a pathway to reconnect to that unitary consciousness within us. So while appreciating the diversity as a multilingual genius, Sri Aurobindo's call is also to all those who are engaged in the study of language to tap into that universal spirit and reconnect to that oneness which will allow this diversity to live in harmony with each other. And in the context of the Sanskrit language, he says that the language itself, as has been universally recognized by those competent to form a judgment, is one of the most magnificent, the most perfect and wonderfully sufficient literary instruments developed by the human mind, at once majestic and sweet and flexible, strong and clearly formed, and full and vibrant and subtle, and its quality and character is very much needed for the Indian civilization. He says that Sanskrit ought still to have a future as a language of the learned, and it will not be a good day for India in particular when the ancient tongue ceases entirely to be written or spoken. But if it is to survive, it must get rid of the curse of the heavy pedantic style, contracted by it in its decline with the lumbering impossible compounds and the overweight of hair-splitting erudition. The Sanskrit articles in this number are learned and laborious, but they suffer heavily from this defect in style. He said, if the contact established with the Sanskrit research can teach the new scholarship the patient thoroughness and the old and flexibility and penetrating critical sense of the view, it will have done to both a great and much needed service. So, for this nation, the mother and Sri Aurobindo both talked of Sanskrit as the soul of the Indian people, and different nations have their own soul languages. So, as one uses a language, the call once more is to not just get limited by the manifested spirit of the Vaikhari component, the expressed component, but to recognize that it all comes from the source of the Para. And therefore, I think Sri Aurobindo's contribution as a Rishi is to tie in this diverse or these diverse pearls that are there in that one necklace that enables anyone interested in appreciating the beauty of the multiple languages that exist. So, Bahu Dhanyavadaha. Thank you.